Julian Reyes trusted numbers more than people. Numbers did not lie, and they did not need forgiveness. A number told you exactly where you stood, no matter how much you wished it were different. People, and the stories they told about themselves, were a different kind of system. They had noise in the signal. They had parts that never balanced. Julian had spent his whole career learning to read voltage curves and internal resistance charts, because those never once looked back at him with grief in their eyes. He lived alone in a small rented house at the edge of Amber Mesa, Nevada, where the desert met the first low hills. At 39, he stood tall, built solid and lean from years of field work. With dark hair, he kept cut short and out of his way. Most nights looked the same. He would check the sensor logs from 3 counties, note anything strange, and go to bed early. It was a life built for one person, and he had built it carefully, the same way he built a battery pack, cell by cell, with nothing left loose. 2 years had passed since Peter Ashworth died. Peter had been Julian's closest friend since their first year of graduate school, back when they shared a cramped lab bench and worked late on an idea that felt too big for 2 students to finish. That idea, years later, grew into something the whole clean energy industry now depended on. Peter had gone on to build it further at Solantis Energy Systems, the battery plant that anchored a growing share of the regional grid. Julian had left the corporate world to become an independent safety consultant, on call whenever a system near the edge of failure needed a second set of trained eyes. In those 2 years, Julian had barely spoken to Wren, Peter's wife, or to their small daughter, June. It was not an accident. It was a wall he had built on purpose, brick by brick, and he had never let himself think too hard about why. He told himself it was respect for their grief, giving them room to heal without an old friend standing in the doorway as a reminder of what they had lost. That explanation had held up fine for 2 years, mostly because no one had ever asked him to test it out loud. The call came just after 6 in the morning, when the heat had already climbed past 100 degrees. It was county dispatch, and the voice on the line was fast and tight with worry. "We need you at Sagebrush Elementary," the dispatcher said. "Battery storage failure. Cooling system is down, and the cell temperatures are climbing. There's a science camp running inside." "Who's on site already?" Julian asked, already reaching for his truck keys. "Wren Ashworth. She's the grid engineer on call, but she says she needs a battery specialist. Says it's heading toward thermal runaway." Julian's chest tightened at the name, quick and unexpected, like a valve closing before he could stop it. He had not heard anyone say it out loud in months. "How many kids inside?" he asked, already pulling on his boots. "County says around 20. Camp counselors are trying to move them out now, but the heat outside isn't much safer than the heat inside." "I'm on my way," he said, and hung up before his own hesitation could catch up with him. The equipment room at Sagebrush Elementary was hot enough to fog his glasses the moment he stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of scorched plastic. Wren was crouched beside a battery rack, her dark golden hair coming loose from its tie in the heat, her shirt soaked through with sweat, a small fan angled uselessly at the glowing case of a failing module. She was 31, small-boned and pretty in a way that looked entirely unbothered by the moment, though her hands were not steady. June sat nearby on an overturned crate, the same dark gold hair damp against her forehead, watching everything with wide, serious eyes, her small hands folded in her lap. Wren looked up. For one long second, neither of them spoke, both of them taking the measure of a stranger they already half knew. "Julian," she said, and something in her voice was careful, the way a person is careful with a name they have not needed to use in a long time. "Wren," he answered, and knelt beside the rack without another word, glad, in that moment, for a problem he understood far better than the one standing in front of him. He traced the wiring with quick, practiced hands, checking cell voltages against the readout on his tablet. One module had crossed its safe temperature limit and was pulling the whole rack toward failure. He isolated it, rerouted the load, and watched the numbers begin to fall back into range. "Talk to me," Wren said, kneeling close, her voice tight but steady. "Are we losing the whole rack, or just the one module?" "Just the one, if I can hold this bypass," Julian said, his hands moving fast now, the old rhythm of the work taking over. "Give me 60 seconds." She counted them out loud without being asked. Low and even, and something in Julian eased at the sound of it, a second set of hands he had not expected to trust so quickly. While he worked, some part of his attention kept drifting toward the crate. June, who usually shied from strangers, according to what little Julian remembered Peter once saying, sat perfectly still and calm, her eyes following Julian's hands as if she already trusted them. It struck him as strange, the way a number feels strange when it lands exactly where you expected before you have checked your work twice. By the time the rack stabilized, the room had gone quiet except for the low hum of restored cooling fans. Wren wiped her face with her forearm and looked at him with something between relief and old, complicated hurt. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't know who else to call." "You called the right person," Julian said, and felt, with some surprise, how true that sentence was in more ways than one. He came back 3 days later with a spare inverter part, the kind of small technical favor that needed no explanation. Wren answered the door in work clothes, county badge still clipped to her collar, and did not look surprised to see him. "I was in the area," Julian said, which was not entirely true. "You're always in the area now," Wren said, but she stepped aside to let him in, and there was no edge in her voice, only a tired kind of amusement. June was on the living room floor, and the moment she saw him, she reached both arms up, demanding to be lifted. Julian obliged, feeling the same strange hitch in his chest from the equipment room. "She doesn't do that with people," Wren said quietly, watching from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed loosely, more thoughtful than guarded. That evening, June sat on the rug building a tower of wooden blocks, her small tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Julian knelt beside her, steadying the tower with 2 careful fingers each time it leaned, matching her patience block for block. "More," June said, holding up a red block like it was a piece of important evidence. "Careful. Everything falls easy if you rush it," Julian said, and guided her hand slowly toward the top, letting her set the piece herself. "Slow. Slow is strong. Slow," June repeated, testing the word in her mouth, and set the block down with exaggerated care, her small shoulders tight with focus. When the tower finally held, she clapped both hands and let out a bright, unguarded laugh, and Julian felt an answering smile pull at his own mouth, a muscle relearning emotion it had not used in longer than he wanted to admit. Wren watched from the kitchen island, a dish towel forgotten in her hands. Her weight shifted onto one hip in a posture that had gone soft with watching. When the tower finally toppled and June laughed again, louder this time, something in Wren's shoulders loosened that had not loosened in a long time, a small release she did not seem to notice in herself. "She hasn't built anything that tall in months," Wren said, half to herself. "Maybe she just needed someone slow enough to hold the top steady," Julian said, and did not look up from the blocks when he said it. They sat on the porch after June had gone to bed, the desert cooling slowly around them, the sky turning the deep orange of a dying coal. Wren pulled her knees up to her chest, a small, private gesture that made her look younger than her years, her chin resting on folded arms. "You knew Peter longer than I did," she said. "Grad school, right? He told me you two nearly burned down a lab bench once." "We were young, and the fume hood was slow," Julian said, and Wren laughed, a short surprised sound, before her face settled back into something quieter. "You never came around, though," she said, turning her head toward him, her eyes steady in the fading light. "Not once in 2 years. I used to lie awake wondering if I did something wrong, or if you just didn't like me. It's a strange thing, losing your husband's best friend along with your husband. Julian looked out at the darkening hills, choosing each word the way he chose a safety margin, carefully, with more room than felt comfortable. His hands, usually so steady, pressed flat against his knees, as if bracing for a reading he already suspected would come back wrong. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "I stayed away because I'm carrying something. Something that isn't mine to explain yet. I know how that sounds. I promise you, it isn't what it sounds like." Wren studied him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly, weighing the sentence the way an engineer weighs an incomplete data set, looking for the missing variable instead of jumping to the nearest conclusion. "That's a strange thing to say to someone," she said, but her voice held curiosity, not suspicion, not yet. "Is it about Peter?" "It's about a promise I made him," Julian said carefully. "That's all I can give you right now. I know that isn't fair to ask of you." "No," Wren said slowly, "but I've learned that some promises take time to become fair. Peter kept his own, kind of quiet sometimes, near the end. I hated it then. I think I understood it a little more after." She did not answer right away after that. Instead, she reached over and rested her hand near his on the porch step, not quite touching, the kind of gesture that says more than words are ready to, her palm open on the worn wood, as if offering him a place to land whenever he was ready. The phone rang at 11 at night. 2 weeks later, and Wren's voice on the line was thin and fast in a way Julian had never heard before. "She's burning up," Wren said. 103. "The power just went out with the storm, and the house is like an oven. Julian, I don't know if I should drive her to the clinic through this or wait it out. I can't think straight." "Don't drive through it," Julian said, already pulling on his boots with the phone wedged against his shoulder. "Sponge her down, lukewarm water, not cold. I'm 5 minutes out. I'm bringing power." He arrived with a portable battery unit under one arm, the same rugged kind he carried for grid failures, and within minutes he had a fan and a single lamp running off it in June's room, the desert storm still hammering rain against the windows outside. June lay flushed and miserable on top of her covers, whimpering in a way that had nothing playful left in it, and Wren knelt beside the bed with a cool cloth, her hands unsteady from more than just fear. "You don't have to stay," Wren said, not looking up. "You've already done more than enough." "I'm not going anywhere," Julian said, and pulled a second chair up beside hers, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and settled in for the night the way he once settled in for a long shift monitoring an unstable rack, patient and unhurried, refusing to let his attention drift even once. By 3 in the morning the fever had broken, and June slept curled against her mother's side, her small fist closed around 2 of Julian's fingers, refusing to let go even in sleep. Wren watched the 2 of them, her own eyes heavy with exhaustion and something warmer underneath it, and thought, with a kind of quiet alarm, that she had stopped being able to picture a bad night without him in it. He was still there in the morning, making coffee in a kitchen that was not his, moving around the cabinets with an ease that surprised them both. "You know where the mugs are now," Wren said, leaning in the doorway, her hair a mess, a blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "I pay attention," Julian said, pouring 2 cups. "It's the job. Is that what this is? A job?" Wren asked, raising an eyebrow, crossing the kitchen to take the mug from his hand, her fingers brushing his and staying there a beat longer than the handoff required. "Emergency backup power," Julian said, his voice light, though his pulse had picked up in a way no diagnostic chart could have predicted. "Available for grid failures, mechanical failures, and now, apparently, fevers. Fully redundant system," Wren said, stepping closer, close enough that he could see the tired smile pulling at the corner of her mouth, close enough that the space between them had nearly disappeared. "Always on call. Never asked for anything back." "I didn't say that part," Julian said quietly, and for a moment neither of them moved, the coffee cooling between them, his eyes dropping to her mouth and back up again, hers doing the same, the kitchen suddenly very small and very quiet. A small voice called from the bedroom, sleepy and cross, breaking the moment before it could finish becoming anything. Wren laughed, a little breathless, and stepped back first, though neither of them moved very far, and neither of them stopped smiling. Julian drove home in the plain light of morning, the storm blown out and gone, the desert washed clean and glittering with leftover rain. He should have felt light. Instead, his hands gripped the wheel harder than the empty road required, his jaw tight, with a feeling he recognized but did not want to name. He was falling for his best friend's wife. He could call it anything else: careful distance, protective instinct, a debt of loyalty finally paid forward, but none of those words held up under any honest kind of testing anymore. And the closer he let himself get to Wren, the closer he got to June, the harder it became to keep the one promise that mattered most, the one Peter had asked him to carry quietly until it was safe. Every night he spent in that kitchen, every small, unguarded moment, narrowed the margin he had left for silence. He was afraid, too, in a way that had nothing to do with voltage or thermal limits. Afraid of loving a child who was not his and losing her anyway if this went wrong. Afraid of loving Wren and becoming just one more loss stacked on top of the one she had already survived. Afraid, most of all, that the secret sitting quietly in his truck, in a folder he was careful never to leave lying around, would someday reach her before he found the right way to explain it, and that everything good now building between them would collapse under the weight of a misunderstanding he had never meant to create. He parked in his own driveway and sat there a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, watching the sun climb over the hills. Whatever this was, he thought, it was already too late to stop it. He did not think he wanted it anymore. The Harvest Star Festival filled the fairground at the edge of town with lantern light and the smell of roasted corn. Strings of paper lanterns swayed overhead, and somewhere near the stage, a fiddle player worked through an old, familiar tune. June had fallen asleep in her small wagon, worn out from spinning under the string lights, and Wren and Julian stood near the edge of the crowd, the desert sky opening wide and bright above them, close enough for their shoulders to touch without either of them moving away. "I used to think my whole life was just a set of numbers to get through," Julian said, watching the lanterns rise, his voice quieter than usual, softened by the noise of the crowd around them. Days counted, tasks finished, nothing left owed to anyone. I liked it that way. Numbers don't ask for anything back. "And now?" Wren asked, watching his face instead of the lanterns. Then June grabbed my hand in that equipment room, and the count stopped meaning anything. Julian said, "I haven't been able to get back to counting since. I'm not sure I want to." Wren turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with something that was not quite tears, her arms loosely crossed as if holding something steady inside her chest. "Julian," she said softly, "are you telling me something, or are you asking me something?" "Both," he said, and for once his voice did not sound careful at all. "I love you. I love that little girl like she's already mine to worry about. I don't know how to say that without saying all of it at once." Wren stepped closer, her forehead nearly touching his, her breath warm in the cooling desert air. "Then don't say all of it at once," she whispered, her hand finding his and holding on. "Just say the part you're sure of." "I'm sure of you," Julian said, and she kissed him there, under the lanterns, with their whole small, complicated family asleep a few feet away, the fiddle still playing somewhere behind them, unhurried and warm. 6 days later, Julian left his work bag at Wren's kitchen table while he ran back to his truck for a spare cable. Wren, clearing space for June's afternoon nap, moved the bag aside and a folder slid halfway out, a corner of paper catching her eye. It was stamped with a seal she recognized instantly, the same one from Peter's old employment file, Solantis Energy Systems, Legal Department. She should have left it alone. She told herself that even as she opened it, her fingers already working the metal clasp free. The first page was a copy of a prior invention disclosure, filed years ago, listing an early concept titled the Adaptive Thermal Runaway Suppression Algorithm. Two names sat side by side at the top of the page, printed in plain, official type: Peter Ashworth, Julian Reyes. Her breath caught, and she read it again, certain she had misread it the first time. Beneath it was a second document, newer, notarized, its language dense and unfamiliar, titled Personal Invention Assignment and Trust Instruction Agreement. Her eyes moved fast, catching fragments she barely understood and understood too well at once. Assignee: Kestrel Safety Ventures, LLC. Sole Managing Member: Julian Reyes. Royalty interest transferred pending further instruction. Her hands had gone cold despite the heat outside. She sat down slowly at her own kitchen table, the folder open in front of her like something that might still bite, and read the pages a third time, searching for a version of the words that would not mean what she thought they meant. She did not find one. Julian came back through the front door, cable in hand, and stopped when he saw her standing at the table, the folder open, her face pale and still. "Wren," he said carefully. "Explain this to me," she said, her voice low and flat, the calm before something much louder. "Peter's algorithm. Peter's work. It's sitting inside a company with your name on it, Julian. Your name, not mine. Not June's. It's not what you think," Julian said, and heard, even as he said it, how weak the words sounded out loud. "Then tell me what it is," Wren said, her voice rising now. 3 years of grief and 2 years of quiet questions finally finding a target, her hands pressed flat on the table, as if to keep herself from shaking apart. "Because from where I'm standing, you let me fall in love with you while you were sitting on my husband's work. You let my daughter climb into your arms while you held something that should have been hers." "I can't explain the details yet," Julian said, his own hands closing in a fist at his sides, not from anger, but from the effort of holding a promise shut. "Peter asked me not to. There's a legal process that isn't finished. If I say the wrong thing now, it could undo everything he was trying to protect." "Protect me from what?" Wren said, her voice cracking now, not from fear but from something closer to fury. "From knowing the truth about my own husband's work? From knowing what my own daughter might one day be owed? You don't get to decide that for me, Julian. Nobody gets to decide that for me. Not even Peter." "Give me a few more weeks," Julian said, his voice low now, closer to pleading than he had ever let it get in front of her. "Maybe less. The moment it's finished, the moment it's safe, I will tell you everything, every page, every reason. I'm asking you to trust me a little longer. The same way you trusted me in that equipment room, before you knew anything about me at all." Wren laughed, a short, ugly sound that carried no humor in it at all, her eyes bright and hard. "Trust you," she said. "You want me to trust the man who's been quietly sitting on my dead husband's work while sleeping 2 feet from his daughter's crib. Do you know what that makes you, Julian? Worse than a stranger. A stranger would have just taken the money and left. You wanted the money and the family that came attached to it." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land. Julian felt something in his chest give way, silent and complete, the way a support beam fails after carrying too much weight for too long. No warning sound before it finally goes. He opened his mouth to answer and found nothing there. No argument sturdy enough to stand against an accusation that cruel, not without breaking the one promise he still had left to keep. He stood very still, every word he might have said locked behind that promise. And in his silence, Wren read exactly the kind of guilt she had feared, mistaking his stillness for a confession he was too much of a coward to speak out loud. "Get out," she said quietly, which was somehow worse than shouting. He left without another word, because there was nothing left he was allowed to say that would not break the one promise still holding him together. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the first fine grit of a building dust storm across the yard, stinging his eyes as he crossed to his truck. By the time he pulled onto the county road, Amber Mesa had nearly disappeared behind a moving wall of sand, the streetlights reduced to dim orange smears, and he drove the whole way home without once checking his mirrors, afraid of what he might see or what he might not. The days that followed were long and silent. Julian buried himself in consulting work at the Solantis lab, running safety checks he did not need to run, staying long after the building emptied out each night. He told no one what had happened, because the only person who could release him from his promise was 2 years in the ground, and some nights he sat at his desk long past midnight, doing nothing at all, just watching the cursor blink on an empty report. A colleague asked him once, in passing, if everything was all right at home. Julian said yes, because it was easier than explaining that home was exactly the problem, and that he had no right to call it that anymore. Late one night, unable to sleep, Wren pulled an old box down from her closet, Peter's things from graduate school, paper she had never had the strength to read closely before. Near the bottom was a worn lab notebook, its cover soft with age. She opened it and found early sketches of circuit, dated years before June was born, before Solantis, before any of it. 2 sets of handwriting filled the margins, trading ideas back and forth like a conversation caught mid-sentence. One was Peter's, quick and slanted. The other, she realized slowly, tracing the careful, blocky letters with one finger, was Julian's. It did not undo her anger, but it planted the first small seed of doubt in the shape of her certainty, and she closed the notebook gently, the way a person closes a door they are not yet ready to walk back through. 2 days later, the phone rang. It was Arthur Pendleton, the attorney who had handled Peter's estate. "Wren," he said, his voice gentle over the line. "I have a letter for you." Peter left it with my office, sealed, with instructions to send it only if certain conditions were met. Julian confirmed those conditions were met last week. "I'm sending it to you now." "What conditions?" Wren asked, gripping the phone tighter than she needed to. "Peter never told me the details," Pendleton said. "Only that Julian would know when it was time, and that I should trust his judgment on the timing completely." He was very specific about that, Wren. He trusted that man with more than most people trust their own family. Her hands trembled as she opened the file on her laptop that evening, after June was finally asleep. "My dearest Wren, if you are reading this, then Julian has finally told you enough of the truth for me to finish the rest. Please do not be angry with him. I asked him to carry this silence, and he has carried it exactly as long as I asked, longer than I ever should have made him. 10 months before I died, the doctors told me the cancer would not let me keep fighting much longer. I spent those months doing the only kind of protecting I knew how to do well, the kind built from paperwork and careful math, because I could not protect you from grief itself, and I did not know how to say goodbye any other way. The safety algorithm was never only mine. Julian and I built the first version of it together in graduate school, long before Solantis, long before you and I ever met. 2 tired students at a lab bench, arguing over one idea until it finally made sense. When I brought it to the company and grew it further, I knew Solantis' contract would claim the finished version completely, the way it claims everything an employee builds on company time. I did not want that inheritance stolen from June before she was even born. So Julian and I built a different kind of shelter. We filed the old disclosure, the one that proves the idea began before Solantis ever touched it. I hired a patent attorney named Corinne Halloway, someone Solantis had never worked with and never would, to draft the trust structure properly through Julian's company, not because he wanted ownership, but because a claim coming from a friend outside Solantis was safer, cleaner, and far less likely to be swallowed by a corporate lawsuit than a claim coming from a grieving widow with a newborn. Solantis has lawyers who protect the company first. I did not want you spending June's first years in depositions and courtrooms, fighting people whose only job was to make you tired enough to give up. I asked Julian to stay quiet about all of it until the patent process matured enough to survive a challenge, and to stay a little distant from you in June until then, so no one could argue that our family had been involved in the arrangement from the start. That distance was never coldness, Wren. It was the last gift he had to give us. He has been carrying this alone for 2 years, so that June could carry nothing at all. Please forgive him. He did not choose this burden for himself. I asked it of him, and he never once told me no, even when I could see what it would cost him. And please, when it is time, let him carry something lighter with you instead. I loved you both more than any number could ever measure. Peter. The letter blurred on the screen. Wren pressed both hands over her mouth, the shape of 2 years of small, unanswered questions finally settling into place. Julian had not hidden a theft. He had carried the weight of a dying man's last careful plan, alone, so that she would never have to. Outside, the wind was rising again, the dust storm returning stronger than before, rattling the window glass in its old frame. She checked the county transit board on her phone and found the last outbound bus of the night, leaving Amber Mesa at 9. Julian's name was nowhere on the passenger list, but she remembered, with sudden clarity, a conversation from weeks ago about a consulting contract waiting for him 2 states away, one he had mentioned only once, only in passing, back when leaving still sounded like the safest thing left to do. The road to the county bus depot disappeared and reappeared through curtains of blowing sand, the headlights barely cutting 3-car lengths into the storm. Wren gripped the wheel with both hands, her knuckles pale, June strapped tightly in the back seat, humming to herself as if the world outside the windows were nothing at all. "Almost there, baby," Wren said, though she was not entirely sure it was true, the wipers fighting a losing argument against the dust. Twice the truck ahead of her slowed to a near stop in the whiteout of sand, and twice she forced herself to breathe, to ease off the gas instead of pressing harder, the old lesson from every winter storm she had ever driven through returning to her hands before it reached her mind. Panic did not move a vehicle faster. It only made the margins smaller. She thought, in a strange, distant way, that Julian would have said something almost exactly like that. The depot lot was nearly empty, one bus idling at the platform, its engine a low growl beneath the wind, exhaust fumes bending sideways in the gusts. Wren left the car running and ran, June on her hip, the grit stinging her eyes and catching in her throat, until she saw him there, a duffel bag over one shoulder, one foot already lifted toward the bus door, his shoulders drawn in against the wind and against something heavier than weather. Julian. He turned. For a moment he simply stood there, hair whipped sideways by the wind, disbelief playing across his face, the duffel bag slipping slightly from his grip as if his hand had forgotten what it was holding. "I read the letter," Wren said, breathless, stopping just short of him, her chest rising and falling fast, June's small arm wrapped around her neck. "I read all of it. Julian, I am so sorry. I should have asked before I accused you of anything. I should have trusted the man who spent 2 years protecting my daughter and never once asked for anything back." "You didn't know," Julian said, his voice rough, barely audible over the wind. "I couldn't tell you. I promised Peter I'd carry it until it was safe. I would have carried it forever if that's what it took." "You carried it alone," Wren said, stepping closer, the wind tearing at both of them, her free hand reaching for the front of his jacket, as if to anchor them both against the storm. "You didn't have to. Not with us. Not ever again." "I do now," Julian said, and dropped the duffel bag into the dust, closing the last distance between them, wrapping both arms around Wren and June at once, his forehead dropping to rest against Wren's, the storm still moving around them, but no longer touching the small, close space between the three of them. June pressed her small palm against his cheek, the same gesture she had used the very first day in the equipment room, when trust had needed no explanation at all. "Jules," she said, clear and certain. The nickname she had given him weeks ago and never once used by accident. Home now. Julian's throat tightened, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head before answering. Home now, he said. For good, if your mom will still have me. I will, Wren said, laughing through tears she had stopped trying to hide, her hand curling into the collar of his jacket. I already do.